Well, honored to be here, and thank you. I'm going to talk about it's really a slice through Sasaki, some of our work. If other people from Sasaki spoke, you would get a very different set of projects, but I think that some of the big ideas come through that we pursue in the firm. This fellow represents, I think, what Shauna was saying very nicely, that our work involves many hands. This is certainly not about me, but it's really about our teams, and I'll get to that in a second. Perhaps what joins a lot of our work is this enthusiasm for the qualities of urban life. And we look at many, many issues and think about a lot of different things, whether ecological or cultural and contextual, the invention and programming of in urban design, the idea of framework, the notion that urban design is not just big architecture or just purely landscape or landscape urbanism. We have a strong interest in the public realm and public life. And a very important factor is how to communicate the ideas. We spend a lot of time in the office thinking about how to communicate through diagrams and various drawing techniques to communicate what we're trying to convey. And so the teams are made up of all these different components working together very closely, and I can do more of these because there's many more overlays and roles that people play. But the disciplines are transcended and they're very engaged. And so the title that I like to think of in terms of our work, Intersection and Convergence, it's about these disciplines and these ideas coming together to develop projects. These are just some of the people that are involved. Some are here, Martin here, who've been involved in the projects. And this is a slice just through the last few years of projects all drawn at the same scale. And they range from just a few blocks to vast regions. And the projects I'm going to show you tonight are these that go from Jordan to China to Singapore to Guatemala. But I'll start in Detroit. We recently won a competition for a very interesting project in Detroit, and it was done by a team that normally doesn't work on these kinds of projects, but we had a lot of fun with this. The client is a nonprofit, and it's for a place called Techtown next to Wayne State University. And Techtown is actually doing relatively well. Wayne State is certainly a very successful university. Henry Ford hospital systems are nearby. And here you see the site of multiple city blocks. And it's an innovation area that is undergoing a sort of strong evolution. And so we started to think about what is an innovation district, about ideas and production, about many different people coming together, work cycles that aren't traditional 9 to 5, many different size of enterprises, and a whole array of sequences in how technology and companies innovate and grow, how the importance in an innovation district is to allow startups to come in with low costs, using technology to be compact and dynamic, and ultimately in a vibrant community. And we were inspired by places like Tech City in London. This is mapping Twitter communications between different entities. And here you see the relationship of Tech Town to the downtown area, the midtown area, and then the universities. And so you have a number of buildings. Some of the big car companies actually began in some of these buildings. Tech One is a famous building by Albert Kahn. And you have these various companies now in these buildings, energy companies, technology companies, but everything is very inward focused. And we were asked to develop an idea for the neighborhood that would lead to a master plan. And our idea was actually not to do a master plan, but to develop a strategy and a series of catalytic projects. So the idea was to draw out of these buildings and out of these inward-focused environments places that where people could meet and engage with each other and become aware of what each other were doing. And so we looked at the connections, we looked at the surrounding uses and some of the sites, and developed a series of public spaces that could become an organizing idea for this district. So how to draw people out of the buildings and how to get them to engage with each other and meet and what we call promote creative collisions, allow for the unexpected and the spontaneous. So we looked at a couple of key buildings and parking lots and developed a strategy to draw these buildings into these spaces and to create a very dynamic environment very quickly and cheaply. And I'll describe some of the uses in a moment. But as we developed the idea, the idea was to create a place that would allow people to come across it, to engage with it, to bring what they're doing in their various companies to the space. And we gave it a very strong identity that would be visible throughout the district and allowed for an evolution of uses that can happen over time, over different times of day and different events as they're programmed. We described a scenario of different people through the district and how they would experience the place. And so that the idea is that students, company people, people in the medical industry, people in very small startups would all have a place to go. And using paint and temporary pavilions and shade structures begin to draw out people from their buildings. Established a cafe, a climbing wall next to a school. It becomes a meeting place where you can actually work and just stop by for a drink. Found local companies that have food trucks and set up a place where they could come on weekends and different times of the day to set up temporary restaurants, different kinds of meeting spaces, and what we called a fab lab, a fabrication lab, where high technology equipment would be available and then might extend out into the space where people would assemble prototypes and models and share the technology. Looked at different times of the year. In spring time, maybe a solar competition, the summer market times, winter skating, bonfires. And so it became really about the 24/7 environment, not just a place of work, but a place where people could live and do things that are between their world of research. And so livability, the idea of social sustainability, was a critical idea. As well as the use of technology, we thought of the district as a digital mirror. How could you get information? How could you find out what was happening in the area? How could you find out how much energy was being consumed or produced? Many different aspects of the district could be made available through this kind of technology. So we're actually just getting started on that project, the real project now, working with a client, just having a kickoff meeting in November. The exact opposite, I guess, of that is this place, which is the Dead Sea in Jordan. We were invited by an agency of the government to develop a strategic plan for the Jordanian side of the Dead Sea. And immensely complicated place for us. We'd never been there before. The Dead Sea, everything you know about water and aquatic life and ecology, at the Dead Sea, it's the exact opposite. There is no life, there's no relationship between the land and the water. There's no exchange. The water is very dense, and in fact, you float on it. You can't even stand in it. It's so salty. So, and it's a place of mind-boggling history, recorded history, of all these different kinds of people that have lived here. And the Dead Sea is up. It's that dot in the north there. And so you have Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Syria, all around this place. And it's a very dramatic landscape. It's the lowest place on Earth, minus 400 meters. And here you see from the hills and the escarpment looking towards the west, Israel and Palestine. And incredible history just all around our site, which is 40 square kilometers at the northeastern corner. Petra is nearby. But the sea is an area of incredible interest and is being transformed and has been transformed very rapidly, the environment, into an area of problems. And there is an existing community called Sweme, which is destitute and very poor and very poorly looked after, no infrastructure, no public realm, really. You can just see the condition of the main street and the sidewalk, no sewage systems. And you see the development of resorts, very inward-focused resorts, ruining the whole edge of the sea. This has been going on for about 25 years. The inside of the resorts are very exotic and dramatic, but you have to pay to go inside. This is what the public gets. This is the public realm at the Dead Sea, or what's left of it. And so areas that you think are open and accessible are actually going to become completely developed. And the reason is that the government in the early 90s or late mid-80s sold off a lot of land all around the sea for these resorts. And so they have lost control of the development. And what we were asked to look at was the orange parts of the land, about 40 square kilometers of unsold land. What should the government do? A number of years ago, they, after being alarmed at all the land that was sold off, decided to put a huge area of the escarpment and the hills into a natural reserve, but all that was left of the edge of the Dead Sea were these tiny little fragments of public land. And Swayme completely turned its back to the sea. So you had no sense of relationship to the sea. And that red line that comes along the edge is a highway built by the Japanese government as a gift, and that is the sort of connector that ties it all together. So we spent a lot of time mapping the area, understanding it, talking to locals, meeting with villagers, meeting with government officials, and began to develop a strategy of how to think about a balanced approach to development, and one that really began to establish a public realm. And we began by analyzing the place, looking at its natural features, the wadis, or the whole drainage pattern became a major driver of our ideas. Looking at these patterns which can be very exotic and dramatic, but also very dangerous when storms come or flows can really tear down a concrete building. So you have to be careful. And here you see one of the most dramatic ones carved out over centuries by the flow of water. The wadis move around. In fact, that line on the left is the path of the Jordan River just over about 50 years. It's changed dramatically. So big argument with the client to set back development from this. The client is very eager to sell land, make money for the government. It's not a rich country. They have no oil, no real resources. And so tourism and development is very important. But we convinced them to use the wadis as a resource and to work with them as a place that contributes to the natural wonder. The sea is actually dropping about 1 meter a year. The Jordan River is completely dried up, and there's a plan actually to build a canal from the Red Sea to help replenish this, and it's obviously a very complicated project, but we had to work with a coastline that would be evolving over time. And part of our work was to look at the natural habitats and understand the place. So a key aspect of the work was the economics and the financial aspect. They were going to use the land and evolution and development of the Dead Sea area to improve the infrastructure for the community and the nation. And so how do you take these separate resorts, which are all operating independently? People come there, they stay for 3 days, and they leave and do nothing else. How can you think of them as value chains that add up to something more? And our idea was to develop a series of nodes and focal points that would be mixed use and completely open, so that people who lived there, who were just visiting or came to a resort, would have many different things to do. And we used this strategy to engage with the sea itself. So connecting the city, the town of Swayme, back to the sea, back to a public realm, and developing in a very strategic way relationships to the water, the hills, and the movement system. A very interesting aspect at the northern edge was the tamarisk, which is a very interesting part of the ecology of the region and the bird flyway. A lot of temptation by the client to just wipe this out and develop the land. It's really the best part of the area. And we convinced them to save it and to develop really an ecological park with a number of public beaches at the edge, and to create a whole new front to Swayme, this Corniche area I'll show you, and between it all flow the wadis to the from the hills to the water. And so Sweme finally has a face on the sea, and we could develop a series of public realms that would be fronted onto by much smaller and fine-grained pattern of development, so that the development at the Dead Sea wouldn't just be these mega resorts by these international companies like Hyatt and things like that, but would actually be small investors who would develop this over time. And we then connected that back into the town, made every connection we could, and I'll talk a bit about the town in a moment. So here was the new Corniche with the pattern of development. It's just one scenario of many small hotels, retail, commercial, and these nodes, these mixed-use nodes at either end. What the edge might be and some of the ecological strategies in terms of the building and orientation and movement. And so this is how Sweme might, in fact, ultimately relate to the sea. You have the Tamarisk ecological zone, and you have this great Corniche of small-scale buildings, mixed-use, cafes, restaurants, hotels, residential, anything really that could be developed here, all overlooking the area. And then a series of more intense development at these very strategic places where the visitor center set up at the end of the street, and that's that blue dot. And from that, you get an amazing orientation of the whole district in relation to the sunset, and an utter transformation from these privatized worlds to this public, new public realm. And you recognize these places that are just a few kilometers away. Jerusalem, just 20 kilometers. And when we were doing this, Jericho had its 5,000th anniversary as a city. So we were thinking like, well, Boston's what, about 300? And so developed a series of guidelines and controls that would help this much more dynamic urbanism to evolve. And then when you pull back, you see that new face to the sea for Sweme and the resorts evolving in the distance. So Sweme itself, very, very difficult to work there because the government controlled almost no land. And furthermore, they'd made a huge mistake in selling land in wadis to naive owners who thought they could build houses there, which you really can't. It's very dangerous. So part of this was actually a strategy for land swaps. But there was one place in that yellow area up on the top left where at a major entry to the town, we could make a whole new settlement and response to the lack of community facilities and affordable housing and public space. And so we preserved these small wadis, we integrated them into the new district, connected up every street we could, and made a new entry to the town in this area. Looked at different building types for family clusters and mosques and small schools and other kinds of facilities, as well as a new main street commercial spine, which would ultimately lead to the Corniche and the Dead Sea itself. And so this became the new entry area to Sweme with a community park and the main street. The schools facing onto those areas. And a key strategy had to do with how we were dealing with water and sewage treatment. Part of selling the land for development allowed the government to build a sewage treatment plant, which would allow reuse of water for irrigation, toilets and things like that, so that the cesspool approach, which was poisoning the wells and the water table, causing a lot of flies in the area, and unhealthy environments could be completely transformed. And this, in fact, is now happening in the implementation. Developed a transit system to link all the areas so people wouldn't have to drive, and then looked at a few strategic areas, which you see in these red, where the government still controlled little slithers of land that could be developed. And here's one from a parking lot that's hardly ever used, except for an annual car rally. You see a big hotel and conference center that's been built next to the sea. And our idea was to create this sort of mixed-use area up on the hill, and then to make these connections down the hillsides towards the water with a series of public realms and smaller development parcels that would strategically frame views and create a whole new kind of relationship to the water and the horizon. So you can see us working with the wadis, protecting them, setting back. And so instead of this private world facing the sea, you had a whole new public realm. This project is a competition that we recently did, and it's the exact same size as the Dead Sea project, 40 square kilometers. Martin and a whole lot of people worked on that. This one, we had a lot of fun. It was a real experiment for us, this thing. And it's actually part of a previous competition that we won. We actually won a competition for an area, just in this area, called the National Creative Cluster, which is a strategy by the government to advance creative industries in China. And we were then asked by the local government to look at a site much, much bigger, and I'll talk about that. The site is in the eastern part of Beijing and occupies quite a strategic location. It's the same size as Manhattan, which is very intimidating. It's on a major growth path of the city, and where there's going to be a significant transit line extended to the area. It sits in an agricultural zone, but it is rapidly developing with housing, with towers, with some really poorly planned environments, and the agriculture is slowly getting destroyed. And here you see that pattern of development. One of the interesting things about this area is there's been a huge investment in art and artist communities in this area. And that was actually a key triggering idea by the government to evolve this as a creative industries area. They were also very interested in agriculture and farming, how that could become part of the development. And they left it up to us to think of strategies to make proposals. Here you see some of the artist communities being developed, artist studios, galleries, incredible investment going on in Chinese culture and cultural development in this area. Lots of water issues, landscape, ecology issues. There you see some of the development, not on our site, but near our site, just sort of extending out in a sort of tower sprawl. And you see the agriculture, the pattern of agriculture that is slowly being destroyed. And part of our challenge was how to address this and how to develop an urbanism that keeps things more in balance. There's a government control plan, there always is, and their idea was to consolidate development, but it's so huge and would ultimately, that's what you see here, and ultimately we know it would just sprawl furthermore into the landscape. We had to work with that, but we were free to make some significant changes in strategy. So here you have the Chinese national strategy to move away from purely production and factory economy to a creative economy, from made in China to designed in China. Sort of the opposite of, I guess, the Apple philosophy, or to move away from that if they could. And so part of our work was to invent program ideas for how this area could evolve. This is part of that competition that we won, just one corner of the site, and I won't get too much into this. I'll look at the bigger picture rather. And our idea was to protect or to develop a framework that would allow agriculture and farming to coexist with urbanization, and to develop these sort of creative clusters, which would be a series of settlements framing this farm landscape and working within a very complex and diverse ecological framework. One of the things we had to do was keep the road pattern proposed by the government in their control plan, which was a huge frustration because many of the roads didn't exist yet, but were committed and set. And then we also worked in the existing pattern of development, so try to integrate as much as what was there as possible. And so looking for this balanced approach of urbanization and agriculture and farming, thinking about qualities of life, what makes a livable environment in Chinese culture, in sort of evolving 21st century economies, looking at a diversity of development types, from the existing villages to residential areas to creative industries, live work, office, and all through a range of agricultural and farming communities. The site hydrology was a key driver. It's an arid region, but there's a whole series of canals and waterways that we wanted to work with and had to work with in terms of the ecology of the district. So integrating the canals and understanding how stormwater management would work was a critical driver of the form of the major landscape systems of the area. So you can see how we started to entwine an agricultural pattern, a pattern of canals and waterways, and greenway systems, and existing highways. That's what's slicing through there, and really working with the existing place and overlaying this whole big new idea for the urban development of the area. The road pattern, extending, existing, working with that, and then creating new patterns, a much more fine-grained pattern, connecting it up with transit, making a series of multiple centers and districts, and starting to think about program, all the kind of industries and places that might emerge in this district, from design to agricultural experiments and research and alternative medicine, and with the commercial core being at the bottom of the U, where the major transit extension from the center of Beijing would occur. And so you see this very mixed up land use pattern of these clusters as they emerge, and how the ultimate sort of framework works. One of the ideas that was triggered by, that triggered some of this thinking, was a lecture that Richard Sennett did at Harvard a few months before we started this, where he spoke about borderlands and boundaries, how he liked the idea of a borderland where there's a lot of ambiguity. There's no either one place or another with a fixed line. And this idea of the agriculture and the urbanization being very much entwined with each other was inspired by that. So when you look at this, here it is in the context of Beijing, and that is the Forbidden City over there. There's our project. There's the Olympic site that we worked on a few years ago, which we thought was huge then. So this is just truly monumental. I don't think we've ever developed such a large area in our office at this scale. Looking at the design principles of these mixed-use clusters and the integration with nature and the organization of urban form and diversity. So we'll look at some of these. How to think of these this multi-centered, highly connected environment and how it relates to the farmland, which I'll talk about in a moment. So working with existing canal and making these spines and public spaces that are served by transit, and with these sort of social centers in pink, the community facilities and schools and public spaces, all embraced by these mixed-use clusters of development, which I'll show you a bit more in a moment. So multiple systems working here, the urban districts, the greenways of the recreation, sports, and larger park systems, the agriculture, the canal system, all integrated to create this new urban pattern. The transit was critical to give people choice. So whether you walk within your neighborhood, where you have all these different kinds of things going on, or ride your bike or take transit, certainly alternatives to the cars. And so how do we program these places in a flexible way? And it's really around the public realm and the big organizing ideas, looking at how you develop these blocks at the appropriate size and orientation. We looked at different building types, which grew out of Chinese village settlement patterns, and how to reinterpret those into 21st century mixed-use districts. How to think about agriculture from the current scenario of farmland or importing products to consuming them. Could you live in a more integrated setting where urban agriculture is part of the scenario? And so the pattern as it evolved, and you see some of the the major art community which exists in some of the villages that we incorporated into this larger pattern, all embraces and is entwined in the agricultural production economy. And so trying to think of different kinds of economic drivers within this agricultural industry, from production and local markets to culinary arts to research and alternative medicine and all sorts of experiments in agriculture practices. How could these evolve in this kind of borderland idea that is entwined with the urban development? And so here you see just scenarios of different patterns of agriculture as they relate to the urban areas. Experiment zones, and working with our ecologists on whole ecosystems for moving from production to consumption to decomposition to in a kind of integrated circuit. And that is this sort of world of living with food production and living with energy production in a integrated way. So the overall plan, its connection to regional park systems, agriculture systems, with an intelligent network where you can find out what's going on wherever you are. And then looking at the core, which is the major transit hub of the area, where there's a central auction house for the artist community that was part of one of the few program requirements that the client had for us, and major public spaces are part of the larger network that become display spaces for arts and cultural activity, and programming that with different uses, framing these major public event spaces that connect up the cultural and arts community and the agricultural community. It's all part of the same system. The canal system as a central public space with transit and mixed uses. And then what we call the creative business neighborhoods or clusters, trying to invent prototypes for development that would be around courtyards, which is a key building type in China that is being lost. Looking for ways to develop districts in terms of these small components that build up into neighborhoods that are connected with a whole array of community facilities, schools, kind of community infrastructure that is focused around this kind of prototypical idea of this mixed-use district where people work, live, research, have incubator businesses that can evolve over time. And so these areas are all around the kind of major spines. That's what all of these are, different scenarios. And here you see how we connected the existing huge artist settlement that has evolved. And then this was part of that competition that we won before we started. And so what we thought was a gigantic project turned out to just be one corner of an even larger project. The program that evolved here measured almost 280 million square feet to be evolved over about 50 years. So it's the scale of these things is absolutely gigantic. And it was a huge experiment, and we took lots of leaps. I've only shown you a little fragment of what we did there, but I think the teams had a lot of fun pushing the limits. Talking of pushing the limits, another kind of project, a university project. This is at Masdar in Abu Dhabi, the Norman Foster project, and another kind of experiment. He developed a plan for this new mixed-use research community in Abu Dhabi, and they've started to implement it, and it's a kind of fascinating idea, but it's rapidly evolving, and it is even changed since Foster's first buildings were built. This is his vision of this highly walkable, highly compact, very mixed and integrated area, a new city, transit served, and there you see his first building, which is a very interesting and impressive complex of research facilities, living spaces, library, community facilities, that really works, actually, in terms of its response to the climate and culture. But we were asked to look at about 1/3 of Masdar for a new university, and I'll show you that in a moment. But Masdar is inspired by places like this in the Yemen, these sort of high-density, compact areas in an open setting that transform the environment, respond to the heat and climatic condition, narrow spaces, shaded spaces, making it actually quite humane and quite possible for a great urban life. We looked at many inspirations for this that even I don't think Foster had found, but they had done a very impressive amount of work on this. And here you see the area we were asked to look at. I think it's about 200 acres of the area. And this is from Foster's, one of many diagrams produced by the Foster office. You see this transit line connecting the development to the rest of the city, these greenways, which are the cooling air paths as they flow through the city, and this very fine-grained network of streets and paths, not really cars, though. It's very pedestrian-oriented, and this is what was behind the whole Foster idea, this 35-foot-high elevated deck, which was the public realm of the new city, and underneath was all the infrastructure, and with these moving pods and transit lines and other kinds of services hidden away, and that all proved to be completely unfeasible. I think they eventually calculated that it would cost about $25 billion just to create the ground plane on which you could then build the development. So very quickly after the first Foster building was completed, they decided to push everything back onto the ground, and that became a major challenge for us to deal with. And so our idea for the university was this very fine-grained pattern of development that would be completely integrated with the rest of Masdar, but would still retain some kind of strong identity for itself as a research university, a science-oriented research university. And here you see the kind of land use pattern that we developed. This orange building was the Foster, his first implemented building. This is the Masdar headquarters, which I think is finally under construction now. And our idea was to develop the university in relation to the greenways there as a sort of major organizing idea, with a major entry coming from the edge or from many other points in the city. And at the heart of the university and the academic core was what we called a student hub. We did not want an administration building as the dominant image of the university or function of the university. We wanted students at the heart of the university. So a very compact academic core, the student hub at its heart, medical and research in medicine in this area. And then the purple were all these allied research facilities, very much like what you see at University Park or Kendall Square, except here completely entwined with the university and surrounded by these residential areas. The university had a very high proportion of on-site residential. This is would be the first university that would be completely gender integrated in the UAE. And so you have a very mixed use pattern of development that is then connected back into the rest of Masdar. We looked very carefully at the orientation of the buildings, how to create buildings that self-shade, that reduce energy consumption and absorption, and remain as cool as possible without all the air conditioning support that most buildings need. And here you see that pattern of development with this academic core, very flexible buildings. I'll show you in a moment. Here is how we started to work out that academic core with these buildings of lab spaces, teaching spaces, very closely packed, allowing many flexible combinations of uses, and with the academic hub being at the heart. The greenway used for all sorts of community facilities. And in the neighborhoods, you see the courtyard housing type of small apartments, the mosques, community centers, and all within very close walking connection to the heart of the university, to the R&D, absolutely, completely integrated. You would never need a car to move around. Within the academic core, a whole network of courtyards, walkways, and then connected up buildings. In the hottest months, you could walk from one end of the complex through to the other without ever going outside if you wanted to. And these are some of the courtyards in that system, looking at energy flows. Worked with Bureau Happold on heat island analysis, shading, and then developed, again, stormwater management and infrastructure through these greenways was most critical. And this was the fundamental change from the Foster plan, to get away from that podium, get everything on the ground, and integrate all the services in a simple way. This is still quite revolutionary for Abu Dhabi, where the utility companies tend to separate all their worlds with big setbacks. Here, there's a lot of shared space, using the street in a very narrow way. This is actually the widest street in our whole development. Whole network of pedestrian connections, bike connections, transit integration, all to make this new 21st century learning, living environment. Another new university in Singapore this time. This was a collaboration with MIT, a very interesting idea the Singapore government had, which was to, Singapore is very interested obviously in science and technology and all these 21st century economic drivers, but it's a country that is very concerned about the development of culture and arts and creative ideas. And they approached MIT to develop a new university that would combine technology and science with design, the design industries, and the business of design. And so the site, here you see in orange, in a sort of complicated area near the airport, an exhibition center, and a business park being developed just south of the university. And here you see a plan by the government for this new business park, which is actually well underway, with this parcel of land, which is about the size of the core area of MIT itself. So we looked at this new paradigm of technology, design, engineering, and science, and tried to create a pattern of organization that could respond to this idea and organize the university in a way where there would be no disciplines. So there wouldn't be an architecture school or a engineering school, but there would be these zones of learning and community interaction for the university. And we developed this idea of the spine, which obviously came out of the endless corridor at MIT. One of the interesting ideas of this university is that all the students would start first year together, whether you were in science or engineering disciplines. You would then move into your specializations, and then come back together again before you graduated with all your experience in the university setting. Also a high amount of housing on site. So inspired by this corridor, which is obviously just more of a movement system than a real place to be, we preferred what you see in the Starter Center. We liked the idea of the exposure of the labs at MIT to visitors just passing by. And so we developed this idea of this great learning spine that would connect up the business park to a major new transit station, allow for these academic clusters to be framing this, and then in another spine, these kind of living learning zones coming off the heart of the university. And this would all be developed in a very tight pattern, again responsive to the Singapore climate of heat, humidity, incredible amounts of intense tropical rain, all within a 4-minute walk of the hub of the university. So extremely compact. This is about 8,500 students. Made a big roof over the spine and public spaces, and really mixed up all the program elements of the university. So the spine sits right next to the main hub building, this kind of design center. Allowed for the air to flow between the big roof, which is just a screen. And here you see the sports and recreation area with the housing, spine, entwined rainwater, gardens, managing the stormwater systems, and learning spaces all entwined on the lower levels of the housing. This project is currently being implemented by UN Studio and another Singapore firm, I can't remember which one, based on our guidelines. For legal reasons, we weren't allowed to proceed with the implementation since we did the master plan according to the Singapore rules. And of course, we had a strategy for a more long-term expansion to almost double the number of students and integrate it much better into the exposition center. The last project I'll show is one we recently finished in Guatemala, again a very different place. A university, a very small university, growing very quickly, is located at the end of the airport runways in Guatemala City, next to the zoo, and completely trapped in its site. And they were given a very large piece of land in a growth path of the city, and we were asked to develop a plan for a new university for about 6,500 students. A very difficult site to work with, but very impressive in its sort of potential, which consisted of this valley with this sort of flat plain, very linear, and you see it nicely at the bottom there, where former agricultural uses, a coffee plantation, which no longer existed, and the valley that passes next to it. The orientation became a major driver of the form of the university, and we decided to work with the land in a way that would preserve the larger systems of the area. There's the way water flowed through the valley, the way the sun moved from east to west, and the way the campus itself and its program was organized in a very integrated way, where student life, learning is very much entwined. And so we developed the pattern with this academic heart on the flattest part of the land, overlooking the valley, passing between, with a hospital and medical research area proposed nearby on the other side of the valley, with the academic development of the campus occurring on this linear spine as a series of clusters all around a series of courtyards and quadrangles that would link all the programmatic elements to each other. Very little housing on this campus. It's just part of the culture that when you go to university, if you're not married, you live at home with your parents. They don't want students living on a campus and if they're not married. And so here you see that pattern of development as it follows that hilltop plateau and looks out at the valley to the left and the right. And so the academic program is arranged in these sort of mixed-use clusters of labs and classrooms and studios. This is a university of architecture, design, fashion, engineering, law, business, quite an array of uses, liberal arts campus. And at the heart is a kind of multi-use student hub building of dining and student services, a library, again with many student services in it, a administration building, and then the different faculties arrayed along this spine. And we designed these so that they could evolve over time. The whole campus would evolve over time, beginning at the hub and moving outwards. And so we've actually designed the first three buildings as academic buildings that will eventually transform themselves as the academic programs move into the academic clusters. Looked at this, the management of water, which is a significant aspect of dealing with the climate here, and green roofs and water management, and reducing energy by organizing the buildings so they have little exposure to the major east and west side. So the middle is this place where all the faculties could come out into the space where all the students would get to know people in departments and faculties they normally aren't involved in. And here you see that core of the university with this natural bowl that we made as a major public space for graduation and university events and recreation. So I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Dennis, will you take
Sure.
Yeah, I guess I want to have a little more information on how you see the Dead Sea as useful for the community and vision growing around it, given that the high salt content of the Dead Sea and the arid torrid climate has made it practically useless except for floating vessels and mining potash. So,
The Dead Sea is besides its cultural significance, there's a lot of economic use of it through potash. There's a huge factory complex, which wasn't at our site. It was halfway down the Dead Sea, and the Jordanian side has a big complex, and the Israelis side has a big complex of potash development. But we saw the Dead Sea and the client as a major engine of economic activity for the country. And the problem in the 80s and 90s was that the people in power there saw the Dead Sea as a way to simply make money, to sell land for resorts and pocket the cash and let those companies take their profits out of the country. Our plan, which was built on a previous study funded by USAID to create a much more balanced approach to protect the environment, to protect the best part of the asset, but to allow for development in a much more controlled way. The problem with that plan is it was very policy-driven and completely unphysical. It was a lot of bubbles and arrows and didn't relate to real development, real places, real development. And so our plan made it all physical, developed a very careful strategy that created not only development, but also a public realm for the Dead Sea. And I think that was the biggest contribution we made. So it'll evolve over 30, 40 years, but in a very controlled way, and in a way that allows for different kind of programs to develop. So I did mention that we had plans for places for a university and schools and other kind of community development, tourism training centers to help create jobs, hotel management. In Sweme, we also developed an area where if you don't think of these things, but the whole laundry services of a resort region currently either being done in the hotels very inefficiently or being shipped to Amman for all these services. And we said, let it be in the community and create jobs and elevate the whole economy. So it's a part of a whole ecosystem of economic and cultural and social development.
Dennis, in the example of the Chinese city, where you're integrating agricultural land,
Yeah.
is that like a strict zoning? I mean, what will prevent the unpredictability of the future development to want to approach and double up agricultural and sitting in?
Yeah, you can't. In the Songzhuan example, what protects the strategy of preserving a significant amount of the land for agriculture? I guess how do you stop sprawl from just careening into it all? I think the idea that we developed in that project was to propose an approach where the two worlds could coexist. So there was a very strong economic incentive to protect agricultural uses, but to really advance, and this is a key part of our work, I think, to advance the quality of agriculture in this part of China so that there would be research, ongoing research and experimentation and new industries related to agriculture, very much part of the creative industries of the surrounding areas. So I guess you do it by a very strong framework and public realm, and then kind of traditional guidelines and sort of zoning strategies.
And I guess like in Europe, the government subsidizes that.
Yeah, if you go to like in the UK or in Germany, you see actually similar patterns of these intense village-like developments sitting in a area of agricultural pattern that would otherwise just be overwhelmed by other forces. Yep. Each one is completely different. It's, the Singapore client working at the Ministry of Education and the university there very different to working in China. China is much more difficult to engage with the client in great detail, although many WebExes and video conferences ongoing through the process. I would say the most surprising client for us was the Dead Sea client, who were the worst client I've ever worked with. I'll go on record with that. And shocking in terms of the team's ability to be optimistic and helpful and useful to them, and to do what I think was a great result. It was a government agency working with a private consultant for the first time, and they were indecisive. They were the chairman of the authority was replaced, I think, 4 or 5 times during our process, and in the end they never paid us our final payment, which we've never had happen before, believe it or not. And so it's very difficult to work with them. Although I must say, when we were focused on the problem at hand and the challenge, it was quite exhilarating. It was their process of working that was very mysterious. They had review committees we weren't aware of. They were taking a long time to comment on things, and we had no idea why, and only discovered afterwards it was all these committees that couldn't agree with each other and couldn't get together. But we persevered. The project took twice as long as our contract allowed for, and I must say, I think other firms would have just walked away halfway through, but we hung in there, and it was quite a ride, I have to say. But the project actually was very successful. They started implementing it while we were still doing the work, and all of this was going on as the Arab Spring was happening, beginning in a serious way in Egypt, which is right next to Jordan. You know, all of this is within like a few hours' drive of the site. So.
Were they interested in developing water activities as well as the edges, like you did in Kuwait? Still probably.
Yeah, that was a real challenge. How to deal with the water's edge, which is moving up and down. It's essentially dropping a meter a year, but I believe they will do this canal to stabilize the water. And the countries, Israel and Jordan, are actually working together on that. And I think there's funding from all sorts of sources for it. And but the challenge is the privatization of the edge. All these resorts have completely privatized edges, and they don't allow outsiders near there. We have in our scheme a strategy to link the entire waterfront edge in front of the hotels, which luckily the government could do because of the dropping, you know, as the sea drops, it exposes a lot of new land. But very complicated, and we actually didn't resolve that aspect of the project in the end.
Boating and like in Kuwait.
We had all these ideas for boating, but you have security issues. Once in a while, we'd be jet fighters flying up north to south. Yeah. We had ideas for ferries and all sorts of things, but apparently the equipment doesn't work in such a salty condition as well.
So, Dennis, extremely interesting projects and ideas, but
Yeah.
graphic, because it's a very coherent graphic language that was present today. So can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, this is very important in our practice. I think that the teams spend a lot of time thinking about how to communicate ideas. And so we not only try and develop conceptual diagrams that explain what it is we're doing, and we think of these in plan, in 3D, in all sorts of different forms and types, in word diagrams, in drawing diagrams. But I think the other thing that we spend a lot of time on is the integration of ideas about landscape, ideas about public realm, and ideas about urban form. We look at things in a lot more detail, I think, than if you were a pure landscape architect or a person or a firm much more interested in the buildings as objects, which of course can be, is fascinating to explore and study, but we try and keep things in a kind of balance, not recognizing that we don't have to be the architects of every building in the project.
I also wanted to compliment the graphics. They're beautiful and coherent for project, and especially the plan graphics, with the way the nature is shown. And that, I think, is a great example, specifically of the use of section diagrams and description of street section, every street section, integration of nature into that section line, the description of solar geometry relative to broken street sections as well as
Yeah.
the plans. I mean, it's incredible to bring that level of detail. And I guess I just wanted to follow with a question regarding your understanding of the existing studio relative to maybe American intellectual capital and creative capital as it's exported abroad.
Interesting.
So I wanted to just sort of pose an idea,
It's-
which is that I sense that you're working with very much with local ecologies, local cultural organizing forms and morphology. And then you're bringing the solar analysis, which is a value that should be a part of every design system. And then if you look at, this plan, which is here, I wonder if, having gone to school with so many people from South America, if this campus is not providing in Guatemala City an experience that they would otherwise come to the West to purchase.
Yeah.
The fact that the dollars are now being kept and captured in Guatemala. I've heard it even stated in presidential debates that America is the future locus of creative economy, design economy. So in a way, when I see this creative design hub being built outskirts of Beijing, I wonder about that positioning and how you feel about that, and what sort of,
Yeah.
how much are you getting from the client as far as, well, what do you suggest? Are you feeding a lot forward and not so much getting from them? Are they really asking for their?
It's interesting. The Guatemala project is an interesting example. Unlike Jordan, one of the best clients we've ever worked with, just a spectacular group. It's a religious university, but a liberal arts program. And we got the feeling, we were hired to do this project. I don't think we ever sent them resumes or examples of our work. It all began, they had an advisor who was helping them with developing this new campus, and they were working with an office in Spain who was doing this all for free or for very little money. And as you know, you get what you pay for, and so it wasn't very well done. And this advisor said to me, can you advise the client on how you get a contour map, how you get a site survey, what should they be doing? And I thought, okay, I'll write them a note, and I just offered some advice. And then it got more and more detailed, and finally they said, why don't you do a proposal for how to do this? And this advisor fellow said, they have no money. So, this is going to be like a $15,000 job. And I said, well, for that we can do a workshop. Maybe a bunch of us will go there and we'll help them, and we will develop an idea, and maybe someone will pick it up. And we did that, and the client says, well, that's not enough, and we really need much more help. So we did a more detailed proposal, and with a whole 6-month process of workshops and meetings. And then it went very quiet, and one day I got a call on my cell phone saying, Dennis, we've decided we want you to do the project. And we went down there and met them and saw the existing campus. But a key part of what we did was advise them on what we consider 21st century learning environments and learning methods. They have a very traditional approach of all the chairs and tables in fixed rows where the teacher comes in and does a lecture and then does it. We had a few projects that are have gone through the build phases that I just decided would take too long to explain. But certainly a lot of these projects, especially in our practice for universities, have been implemented over time. And so we do obviously have a chance to test and explore what worked, what didn't work. But in our practice, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is just a slice through it. We have a whole world of design in the public realm, public spaces, parks, buildings, and so we're constantly mixing up the disciplines and having people who have built libraries work on the libraries in a campus plan, and so we benefit from the whole build practice. Is sort of back and forth.
Well, Dennis, thank you very much for this evening's talk.
Thank you. Thanks.